Hello, Flat Earth researchers, debaters, and debunkers. We've all had a moment in our lives, maybe more than one time, where we had a realization that what we thought or believed or assumed was completely wrong. It might be that someone says something that makes us recognize the error of our thoughts and beliefs beforehand, and then puts everything into a new perspective. And when we're forced into a situation like that, forced into a realization, or it comes unexpectedly when we weren't prepared for it, or to defend against hearing or realizing whatever it might have been that we were told, then we are overwhelmed with a very physical feeling that affects our entire body and being, as it were, because we'll suddenly become very anxious. We might have a rush of adrenaline. Our heart will beat faster. We kind of experience this flush, and this might be in the face, the flush we get from embarrassment, and you feel it down your neck and in your chest. And it might even go down your arms and down your legs. Basically, your whole body goes into this, well, it's really that fight or flight response, that biological response. But of course, because we're dealing with something that is more of a mental thing rather than a physical threat, someone coming at us with a knife or something, then it's a slightly different feeling in that respect than a direct and immediate threat. But it still stems from that fight or flight instinct that we have. And of course, that's why we have fear. And how can there are physical effects that come with fear, but there's also, it's a mix of it, because it's from a psychological aspect. It's a kind of biochemical event that goes on in our bodies because of a thought or a realization that we've had that we are in danger. So we know that a lot of our senses combine to give us this sense of fear. And of course, then our body becomes acutely prepared to fight or flight, whether it's to, the adrenaline comes, the blood flows because you're ready to either defend yourself or run away, either of which is going to take energy. So if that's happened to us, and I'm sure it's happened to every single one of us at some point in our life, whether it's when we were a kid or in adult life, we all have these moments that we can remember where we were caught off guard by probably something someone said or a reaction that someone had that made us realize that our own thoughts and actions were totally unjustified or totally wrong, totally misconceived, and we have this realization that we were fooled. We fooled our own mind with the way we interpreted things. And this, of course, is a growing process. We have to go through these things. Any creature in any kind of sociological structure that lives in a society will have to go through these realizations of the way things are in that society, and you become adept at navigating through that society, conversing with other people and individuals, and with the awareness that you are always being watched. You are always you will be told if you put a foot wrong. That's programmed into us. Those experiences we've had in our past, where we've had a realization that we are wrong, and the memory of the quite horrible feeling that overcomes us because we are now in this fight or flight instinct. That memory stays with us as a way to kind of protect us, to make sure that we can navigate safely through society. whether it's meeting other people, going shopping or working, and understanding the expectations and the culture, the expectations generated by that culture that you are in. The thing is, when we are caught in that kind of situation where we cannot really fight or fly away from the situation we find ourselves in, where someone has said something that causes us to have this realization, this flush of panic and fear all at the same time, which eventually does, of course, ebb away, and ultimately is usually a good thing, because after that we have progressed. We've learned mutually, usually, from the experience, and we can move forward. So it's ultimately beneficial, but of course it's a very unpleasant situation to be in. And so what we will often do is try to give such situations as wide a berth as possible by trying to avoid getting into those situations where we end up having to be in it, when we end up being in a fearful state, when the adrenaline's rushing. And so, it kicks in earlier, I suppose. The fight or flight mode will kick in at the earliest warning that we are entering into a situation where we might have a realization that what we believed was wrong. So this really depends on our mindset, doesn't it? We can either be of that mindset where we completely avoid the chance that we'll get into that situation where we have to admit we were wrong, admit guilt, as it were, avoid that feeling, or we might reflect on the positive things that came later on from going through that, and knowing that actually it was a healthy thing to happen because we had this self-realization. It allowed us to realize that, it's not so bad. I can overcome that. I can go through that, and life goes on, and it would be more fulfilling perhaps because I'm not possessed with the fear. So you can, that's how you can look at it. There's these two ways of looking at it. I think in the story of the horse whisperer, it's a similar situation. You ultimately put the horse through its worst nightmare of having a human on it, and then it realizes that it isn't that bad, and so copes with, and then is I suppose it's then better trained. It's become accustomed to that normality and a realization that they didn't have to be as scared as they were. Now, if you look into any of the atrocities that mankind has been through under various guises of leadership, ending in famines, disasters, massacres. There are numerous ones throughout history, and they are just kind of blips on our radars. But anytime you look into one of these stories a bit more deeply, you'll see that it was not something that happened overnight. Some vice-like grip that a dictator held on the country would never have been something that happened overnight. It would have been always a gradual process. And usually it would have started very small, and there's always a point when you can snip it in the bud. I'm thinking of an example in books such as The Killing Fields, where it was just a small number of people with guns, a small group that was able to control entire populations. And then it built up over time until the whole country was engulfed in this dictatorship that wreaked havoc. But there was a point in the early stages where if majority of people hadn't been ruled by fear, then they would have snipped it in the bud. But because they didn't, things were allowed to continue and get so out of control that they had to run their natural course until the dictator no longer had the same power that they'd had to begin with, for whatever reasons. These things are never permanent, but they do take a long time to resolve if they're not snipped in the bud. It's just like a disease that might be encroaching on a flower or a tree. If you cut it off, then the tree will continue to flourish without the disease. Otherwise, if it's not, then the disease will take over the entire tree and kill it. So these things have happened throughout history, and they continue to happen to this day. It is a constant series of battles and pruning in an ongoing war. And of course, these days, the war is really it's a psychological nature. And while people coming together to demonstrate their ideas, show their numbers, is of course a good countermeasure, it still ultimately comes down to the individual and the decisions that we make as individuals that will then become reality. And so we have to be living with that awareness of our fears, but in control of them, and usually we're to embrace them. Simply recognizing whatever emotion or feeling that we have is progress, is a step in the right direction to dispelling that fear. Of course, the opposite reaction is to have that instinct to fly away, or maybe fight at first and then fly away from any kind of situation that would risk us having that realization that we were in the wrong, and it being obvious to all concerned. As an example, imagine the situation when you are at school and there is a weekly spelling test. And after each week's spelling test, the names of everyone who took the test is put up on the wall with their score, ranking from the best to the worst. Now, imagine you are the worst speller. Maybe you have dyslexia that makes it impossible for you to actually comprehend the words. But your name is at the bottom of that list every week. You were forced into a situation where you had to prove yourself, and you couldn't do it, and then you were embarrassed, held to account for your atrocious score, and look at all the good scores of your peers. So you're in a class of 30. So out of all of those, you are the worst at spelling. And it's put up on the wall for all to see. What's that going to do to your psyche as you grow up, as you enter into more real life situations where you have to then protect yourself from being shown up in public. You've experienced it multiple times in your childhood, so you're going to do your best to avoid it. Now, we're all, just because you can't spell or something, it doesn't mean you're stupid. It's just one of those things that affects certain people. It might be the same with mathematics, and the same situation could happen. You could end up having the lowest score, but it doesn't make you stupid. It's these situations, again, there can be a realization that the people dictating these tests and having expectations from those tests don't understand the real world, and certainly don't understand the mind of someone that doesn't get it. But they will be, in essence, ruling the world with their expectations, ruling that particular corporate culture, scientific culture, where the people that can do it, the people that have been labeled as scientists and mathematicians and geniuses, are the ones that we should all aspire to look up to. And if we can't think in the same way as they can, then we are not worthy. You see, so we live in a world that is dominated by that kind of mindset. And so billions of us must be living in fear. And this, of course, has become very evident over the past few months, that irrational fears are literally destroying livelihoods. Instead of living life, we are living in fear. And that's only because certain people with certain expectations are doing it deliberately to belittle everyone, to have everyone cowering in fear and reacting. It comes in so many guises. So what's the solution? Just recognizing the fear, where it comes from, and understanding that we're always, a fear is because we are predicting some kind of future event. And really, right here and right now, if you're listening to this, your life is not in danger. You are alive and breathing. And that is all that matters. Any fear about what might happen, whether we might get sick or a risk that we could be taking by walking out the door, is irrational. It's not real because it's not now. And it's not real because it's not a real threat. When you realize that even being listed as at the bottom of the class isn't a real threat, it doesn't matter. But of course, at that tender age, it does matter. It does matter how our peers think. It does matter what our elders think of us. It matters hugely, because that's our world. So we can see very clearly, once we have that awareness, how every single step of our lives has been dictated by notions of fear and the expectations of others, rather than our own expectations. We are constantly occupied and distracted from the here and now with those fight or flight fears. So ultimately we realize that we have to face those fears, and that we will benefit from facing those fears. Again, it is because you have that awareness rather than pushing them away or ignoring things. We fully embrace it. We say, okay, the fear is there. Let's examine it. Where does that fear come from? What's it doing to me? What's it doing to my mind? What's it doing to my body? And just that allows us to gain more control. We've then gained control of it just by having awareness. So, I see you. It's like the cat or the dog trying to grab a snack from the counter. It's going to be watching us. Are we watching it? And we spot it. And it stops what it's doing. So imagine the sneaky cat or dog as the ego, or the fear, that lump of fear. We've spotted it, we've recognized it, we've seen it for what it is. And it will recoil, it will recede, simply by being aware of it. And that's very powerful. It literally becomes, this is mind over matter. Because we change the outcome, we change the physical outcome, the tangible outcome that we feel in our bodies, and that, whatever reaction that might have in reality. Just with that awareness, we change our destiny. Because we will no longer be making decisions based on the fight or flight instinct. We have more presence. And so we end up training ourselves to be more aware every time it arises. You constantly have to point, notice. You have to point to the cat. You have to tell it that you've noticed what it's trying to do. But it doesn't mean it's not going to try it a second time or a third time. You have to keep catching it out. So you have to keep catching the fear. And that's the psychological training that we can go through, the evolution our minds can go through. Because we've all been affected much more adversely than any one of us would probably be able to realize at first, by the things I was mentioning earlier on, just by those expectations of society. And we might think we're quite blasé, I don't care, it doesn't mean anything to me. That's not true, because we are all affected by those things. It's what makes us human. It's what makes us sociable creatures. But it really comes down to us as individuals at the end of the day to have those realizations. And of course, with a group, if you feel that you're part of a group, you're not alone in this, then those fears will subside because you suddenly realize that you're not so stupid, you're not so paranoid. It's, of course, therapeutic to know that others suffer in the same way. But I'm here saying that all of us suffer in those ways. No one is exempt from that kind of suffering. It just depends whether we're going to recognize it or not. And this isn't just about looking into flat Earth or any of the other stuff that might come up. This is just, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what conspiracy you're talking about, or that it's very important to have that realization of the reality that we create as a society, mostly based on being controlled by our fears. Because a lot of people have studied it. It is a science, and that is the science that is used on us We are the subjects of these scientific experiments. But the wonderful thing about this is that we do have a choice. We do have that freedom of choice. Thank you very much.
Click subscribe and the bell icon if you'd like to receive notifications of new videos from Phuket Word.